Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back to our professional development webinar series. This is a reminder to those of you who've been attending and those of you who are new that our goal in the series is to provide parish staff and volunteers as well as diocesan ministers the formation, the training, and the tools that they need to create vibrant Catholic parishes and growing ministries. In today's webinar, Marcel LeJeune will guide us through the stages of pre-evangelization, evangelization, and discipleship so that we can apply them to our work in pastoral ministry. My name is Jared Dees. I am the Content Marketing Manager here at Ave Maria Press, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'd like to say quick thanks to all of our webinar partners who've been partnering with us for many years in the series, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, as well as the National Federation of Priests Councils. Just a little technical information. This webinar is being recorded, and you can ask we'll send a recording out to those of you who are here with us live and those of you who couldn't make it live later on this week. And you can ask questions throughout the webinar, and we'll treat as many of those questions as we can towards the end of the presentation today. You can find that section to ask questions in the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. Feel free to type those, and we'll be able to read them towards the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to say a very warm welcome to Marcel, who is the president of and founder of Catholic Missionary Disciples, which helps Catholic leaders in dioceses and parishes become better disciple makers who make other disciple makers. Marcel served as the Associate Director of Campus Ministry at St. Mary's Catholic Center at Texas A&M University for 11 years, and the Director of Campus Ministry at St. Elizabeth's at Texas Tech. He holds a Master's of Theological Studies, specializing in pastoral theology, and he's the author of 3 books, written multiple articles in national Catholic magazines, newspapers, and websites. He's a regular guest on EWTN Radio as well as Relevant Radio, but the most important part of his life and his vocation is being a husband and a father. Marcel and his wife, Christy, have 5 children. So welcome so much, and thanks for presenting for us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Jared. I want to say hello to everybody who's joining us on the webinar. And just a little note, I've got a thunderstorm rolling in, so let's all say a prayer that the lightning doesn't hit and knock out the power of my internet.
Sounds good.
Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw this slide up here so we can go through this slide deck with you. One of the things I want to do, though, before we get started, let's go ahead and say a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Father, we thank you for the blessing of this day. We thank you for the opportunity to gather in your name, and we pray that as we do your work as your church, you might bless us. Help us to have a greater understanding and knowledge of your mission and what part we play in it and how we can do it better. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. I can hear the thunder rolling in. I don't know if it's coming in over my speakers, but, just wanted to let you guys know. Let's say a prayer that doesn't happen. So first of all, I want to talk about evangelization and pre-evangelization and how we get from pre-evangelization to evangelization. And the way we're going to stage this is that, you saw the name of this, the what, why, and how of pre-evangelization, evangelization, and discipleship. That is a huge amount of stuff to try to cover. So what we're going to try to do here today is take a 30,000-foot level at all these things, what they are, try to help you understand a little bit better what they are, what role they play in our pastoral ministry, especially on the ground in parish life and where you might be. And how we as pastoral ministers might be better at trying to live these things out and help others. So the first thing is that pre-evangelization really is aimed at those people who don't have faith, those people who are in a stage before we even evangelize them. That's why, of course, pre-evangelization. This, quite honestly, and I'll get to this in a little bit, is the stage that has the least amount written about it in our Catholic literature. So the magisterial documents, things from the USCCB, even popular books, we're going to have the least amount written about this, the least amount spelled out for us. So really, this is primarily about relationships. It's about building the relationship with somebody who has no faith in order to be able to evangelize them. And that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to build these bridges of trust so that we have the opportunity for somebody to even get on the bridge, because you can't cross that bridge until we have the bridge. And so we're building bridges here. We're building bridges of trust, whether that's with the institution of the church, whether that's with an individual, whether that's with a parish. but primarily between you and another person. So we're talking about pre-evangelization on an individual basis right now. But there is also the contextualization of pre-evangelization that's done at a communal level. This is the way that the local parish communicates with the local community, the way that the diocese interacts with the territory that they cover and the people that live there. Those are also, we can have pre-evangelization there, but until we really break it down into the individual level, we really aren't doing pre-evangelization. So in other words, programs can help, but they're not the point of the work of pre-evangelization. Because you can't really build relationships in a real personal way, in an intimate way, in a way that trust is built up in a programmatic way. So we're going to try to stick away from the program so much, away from the events when we're doing pre-evangelization on this individual basis. Now, pre-evangelization, this stage really has no timetable. And the reason I say that is pre-evangelization is not so much about, okay, we're going to do A, B, C, and D, run somebody through this, and then we're going to get them to the point of being able to evangelize them and then to the point of discipleship. That's not how individuals work, right? So whatever staging we talk about here, really what we have to understand is that it's not based on a timetable that is arbitrary or something that we can just impose upon another person. Every individual is different, as we all know. Now, the thing about it is that we don't want to get stuck in a pre-evangelization stage indefinitely either, where we never move towards an explicit evangelical effort. In other words, we never proclaim the Kerygma, or we never give our testimony, or we never make an invitation to another person to respond to an encounter with Jesus Christ. And a lot of times I think what happens is that folks will get fearful in the pre-evangelization stage of hurting the relationship because, this Jesus thing might not be what they're looking for. But if you and I, as Christians, as Catholics, and as leaders in the Catholic Church, really want to do something good for another person, we have to understand that it's not so much about the work we do, it's about what God's doing in their life. And yes, there are always three players in pre-evangelization, evangelization, discipleship. It's the work that you and I do with another person, the choice that another person is going to make, which is free, and we should not ever try to take anything away from their freedom to be able to make that choice. But really the main driver in this is the grace of Jesus Christ that is given to this person in order for them to have conversion, in order for them to grow closer to God. So we can't fear evangelization ultimately. And really the goal of the stage of pre-evangelization is to kind of clear out the mess, clear out the obstacles that are in somebody's way to being able to say yes to God, to respond to the gospel message, to be able to say, I do want to follow Jesus Christ. So one image that you can think of is in the parable of the sower of the seeds, Jesus talks about the different kinds of soil, right? And before the seed can be sown, you have to prepare the soil. You want to put the seed in good soil. And so pre-evangelization really is the preparation of the soil. And this can be done in multiple ways, but really it has to be bathed in prayer. It has to have an aspect of hospitality. And this is hospitality outside of welcoming somebody at church or having the program at church. This is in your home, in the coffee shop, in the business world, and in other places. Because you're building friendship and you're asking the right kind of questions and you're serving people and you're showing that this Christian life is actually something that has changed you. And that's really what we're trying to get at here with pre-evangelization. And that's how you prep that soil of the soul of another person so that they can receive the seeds of the gospel. So in pre-evangelization, it is mentioned in the church's documents. You can find it in Evangelii Nuntiandi from Paul VI. You can find it in the National Directory for Catechesis. But there's little fleshing out, very little fleshing out of what that looks like on the ground, say in a parish environment, what you're going to do in a diocesan environment, or even individually in your own life. So with this stage, though, we do want to understand this. And Paul VI talked about this. He says, the church carries out this first proclamation of Jesus Christ by a complex and diversified activity, which is sometimes termed pre-evangelization, but which is already evangelization in a true sense, although at its initial and still incomplete stage. So what he's getting at really is saying that it's setting us up for the proclamation of the gospel, because he will go on to say that you can't evangelize unless there is a proclamation of the gospel. So with that being said, let's look at this image here. I hope everybody can clearly see it. This is one way to think of pre-evangelization moving into evangelization and into discipleship. Now, I will be honest, I stole this image from another, and so this is not one that I came up with, but if you have ever read Forming Intentional Disciples by Sherry Waddell, and if you haven't, I highly recommend it. She talks about the thresholds of conversion, the 5 thresholds of conversion, and the first one being trust, and the second, curiosity, openness, and then seeking, and then intentional discipleship. And I'm going to go through each one of these rather quickly, but hopefully in a way that you can understand. But basically, the first 2, trust and curiosity, are really pre-evangelization stages. Okay, this is where we're getting into pre-evangelization. These are what you might call passive stages. And the reason why they're passive is because somebody isn't openly seeking or seeking Jesus Christ. They're not trying to move into some kind of new faith. They're not trying to have this encounter with Jesus Christ, but rather it's about the relationship, this trust. Okay, that's the first step. And it might lead to some curiosity, but curiosity is more of a passive thing. It's not as if they want something out of it. They just want to know more a little bit. They want their questions answered. It's the person who's asking, well, why do Catholics do that? It makes no sense. And they just want their answer to their question. They don't necessarily want Jesus Christ or a relationship with him. So these are the pre-evangelization stages in trust and curiosity. And again, we're trying to build a relationship in order to hopefully prepare their hearts for the proclamation of the gospel. And this is where you start in openness. In the third stage is where somebody actually starts to be a little bit more active. Okay, this is where active starts to happen. And pre-evangelization and evangelization in the stage of openness start to cross over from one to the other. So you start to move into a more active stage where somebody is willing to hear your story of conversion, is willing to possibly even experiment with prayer, to hear the great story of Jesus Christ. And this openness then leads to an active seeking. They want something more, okay? And when they're seeking, that's really where you're starting to move into explicit evangelization. And this explicit evangelization the goal of it is really to move someone towards conversion from an encounter with Jesus Christ. And this conversion, if they drop their nets, like the apostles at the seashore in Galilee, of the Sea of Galilee, they were called by Jesus Christ. He said, "Come, be my disciples. I'll make you fishers of men." And they dropped everything. They dropped their nets in order to respond to him, to say yes. And this is an intentional discipleship moment. Discipleship is not something that is accidental. And this is again, the church has talked about this again and again and again in her documents. We can't just inherit our faith from our parents. It's not something that passively happens to us. Rather, it's an active saying yes to Jesus Christ. And it's not just a moment, one and done. It's again and again and again. But it takes a moment of saying yes. And it takes a dropping of the nets in some way. Now, that dropping of the nets may take years. It might be something where, I've always followed Jesus Christ. But the point is that there is a choice. I'm going to choose to follow Jesus. And that is intentional discipleship, the 5th stage. So we see that pre-evangelization is about relationship, about building trust. That evangelization has to have the explicit proclamation of the gospel, and that discipleship is this living out after this encounter and conversion. Now, so we move on back up into evangelization. And if you notice in Pope Paul VI in the Evangelii Nuntiandi, which was a wonderful document, by the way, about evangelization, he says that there is no true evangelization if the name, the teaching, the life, the promises, the kingdom, and the mystery of Jesus Christ, Nazareth, Son of God, are not proclaimed. So you have to proclaim this. the mystery of Jesus Christ has to be proclaimed. Who he is has to be proclaimed. The gospel message has to be proclaimed. And I think I'll be honest, a lot of Catholics sometimes use the, when necessary, use words that, evangelize always, but when necessary, use words is kind of the scapegoat or the out clause, so that I don't have to proclaim the gospel, so that I don't have to say words. And unfortunately, well, first of all, we know that St. Francis never said that, but unfortunately, I think this culture of silence, or maybe don't ask, don't tell about the relationship you have with Jesus Christ, has led us into some of the issues we have in the church today, where we struggle to evangelize. We struggle to talk about Jesus Christ, to use his name, to even break the code of silence. And if the goal of evangelization is really conversion and intentional discipleship, well, the Bible tells us, St. Paul says, how can one come to believe if one does not have a teacher? Okay? We have to be able to proclaim this stuff in order to allow somebody else the choice. So, in other words, the Kerygma is not optional. That the proclamation of the gospel, this good news, is not an optional part of evangelization. It has to be done in order for evangelization to actually happen. So Francis is echoing this, and he says that when the church summons Christians to take up the task of evangelization, she is simply pointing to the source of authentic personal fulfillment. And one of the things that Francis, if you read Evangelii Gaudium, he really talked about was the fact that it brings joy from us. And I will tell you, one of the things I do now in my work is work with Catholic leaders in dioceses and parishes to help them understand and to do hands-on evangelization and discipleship, so that they're working with other people. And what ends up happening with a lot of pastoral workers is, and I'm sure it's many of the people who are on this webinar could echo this, unfortunately, I think a lot of us, we get caught in management. We get caught in maintaining the status quo, in running the programs and putting on the events and doing the classes and the sacramental formation and the things that a parish or a diocese has to have, right? Or we think this is the work that we're called to do. But we don't see the fruit so much. We don't see the conversion. We don't see this. And we know the statistics. For every one person who's joining the Catholic Church in the United States, we have 6 who are leaving out of the back door. So we're losing so many people who have identified as Catholics. We're not doing the work of evangelization and discipleship well, and we get frustrated in our pastoral work. Now, I know that none of you got into pastoral work to not be fruitful. I know I didn't. I want to be fruitful. And in fact, when I am fruitful, we find personal fulfillment. We find that there's a joy that comes out that's exuded because we see change in other people's lives. We see people grow closer to God. We see their own lives start to transform and have more meaning and fulfillment and happiness and joy because of the faith that they've accepted and are growing in. That's what we want when we work in the church. But unfortunately, I think the way in which we operate doesn't necessarily lend itself to that fruitfulness. And what we really need to do is a return to this pre-evangelization, evangelization, discipleship work in the way of the church has always taught us. And the way I would put it is we need a remembering. We need to remember who we are as a church. We're supposed to be missionary. We're supposed to be evangelical. We're supposed to do this work. We're supposed to help make disciples of all nations. That's what our task is. And so all this work of evangelization it really has 3 different audiences. And we're part of this audience. We're part of the first audience, is to believers, those who are intentional disciples, because we need to grow in our own faith, right? But also, secondly, we need to be evangelizing those who are baptized and who are not believers, though. They've never made a decision to follow Jesus Christ. They've never had a moment of conversion. This is what the new evangelization is aimed at. Individuals and even cultures and societies that were once Christian but no longer have that, maybe having the identity, but don't necessarily have the practice of the faith, don't have that intentionality of the faith. And then finally, to the non-baptized, this is to the agentes, to everybody, to the world, that we're supposed to be a missionary in nature. We're supposed to go out. And, Francis reminds us of this. He says that we cannot forget that evangelization is first and foremost about preaching the gospel to those who do not know Jesus Christ or who have always rejected him. Okay. Now, Francis, in the same document, Evangelii Gaudium, in 19 says, evangelization takes place in obedience to the missionary mandate of Jesus. Now, we know, we're Catholics, we like to be obedient. But I want to go back to the fact that It's not just about doing it because we're supposed to do it. We're doing it because it flows out of our very identity. Our identity as Christians, as Christ followers, is to be missionary. He called the first disciples and said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. At the end of his time on earth, he said, go and make disciples of all nations. And in fact, if we get into the Greek of the Great Commission there, what he's really saying, the English doesn't give it, but you could be better translated from the Greek as, while making disciples, go, baptize, and teach them all that I have taught you. So the point of it is to make disciples. That's the Great Commission. That is what we're called to. That's our very identity as Christ followers, is to also make other Christ followers. But I think what we've done is we've settled for kind of a simple wishy-washy Christianity that sometimes it's too easy on us, that we don't take on this missionary identity. Because that's really what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be fulfilling this great mandate of Jesus Christ. And once we are able to have somebody who is evangelized, somebody who is a disciple, who has this moment of conversion, now we have to do something else with them. And I think this is another kind of fatal flaw in the church right now, is our goal so much is to just get people to the point of conversion that we stop. And this isn't really what Jesus wants. If you look at the model of Jesus Christ, what did he do? He spent 3 years deeply investing in 12 men. And in fact, in the real intimate moments, he would take 3, maybe 4 of them off and really dive deeply with them. So he took a handful of men and spent an immense amount of time with just a small number. Yet, how many people in our parish are using that model? How many of our parishes, our diocesan events, do that? No, we gather the masses and we teach. We gather the masses and we preach. We gather the masses and we worship. And while we still have to do that stuff, Jesus did that. He gathered the masses and he taught. If he wanted to be intimate with somebody, he only had a few, and he invested deeply in them and taught them to do the same with others. That was the model of his life and his ministry that I think we've forgotten. So as a church, you and I are called to this missionary discipleship. We're called not only to make converts, but to help people understand that they're supposed to be missionary too. We're supposed to help equip others to do the same work. This isn't supposed to be a professionalization of ministry. In other words, it's not supposed to be just for the clergy, the religious, and those of us who work for the church who go evangelize and disciple people. It's not supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be ordinary Catholic men and women who are doing this work as well. And to be able to do so confidently, as the USCCB says in Living as Missionary Disciples, we're called to be confident in sharing our faith with other people. And so Pope Francis says, we're not just disciples, we're not just missionaries, we're missionary disciples. And that's where the term came from, right? From Pope Francis, that we're supposed to be missionary disciples. And I think we've settled for too low of a bar. If you think about in Catholic ministry right now, what are the bars? The first bar for somebody is you're going to go to church. Second one is you're going to get all your sacraments. The next one is you go to mass regularly and maybe confession if you're really good. But really the highest bar is you're involved, right? You're involved. But Jesus never talked about being involved. And I want to point that out because, and you don't see the saints talking about involvement. You talk about intimacy with God. You talk about an interior life of prayer. You talk about missions to the world, but we don't talk about involved. So in the 21st century in the United States and the Catholic Church and the way we operate, we need to return to these roots of who we truly are. Now, I want to share this image with you. And this is something that I've been developing over time. And if it's a help for you, then great. If it's not, then you can just have a little happy time right now. But if you look at the very top line, we have strategy, pre-evangelization, evangelization, and discipleship. Okay, so the strategy line is going to tell us the stage, other name for the stage, so what other name where people were moving into, the markers that tell us about that stage, and the needs of the stage. Now, disclaimer real quick. People do not fall neatly into categories just because we assign them to them. And in fact, one of the great things that a friend of mine taught me was we never accept a label in place of a story. So just because we try to identify somebody with these different traits, somebody could be in multiple different categories in different areas of their life, okay? So that's the disclaimer to this. We don't want to just box people up, and therefore we've identified them properly. So let's look real quickly at this. In the pre-evangelization and evangelization stages, these are people who are strangers to Jesus, or people who are seekers, sometimes called, or non-disciples or non-believers. These are people who are spiritually apart from Jesus. They've never intentionally chosen to drop their nets. They're not somebody who has responded to this encounter with Jesus Christ yet. And they may be catechized. They might be sacramentalized, but they're not necessarily evangelized, okay? So what are the needs there? The needs in this stage are they need this initial conversion to Jesus. They're going to need relationship with another person who is a Christian. They're going to have the Kerygma proclaimed to them, and they're going to have an opportunity to respond to that message, okay? What I really want to focus on here is discipleship, because we've already talked quite a bit about pre-evangelization and evangelization. And in this discipleship stage here, what I want to do is I want to look at these different things. So you have the acquaintance of Jesus, also known as an intentional disciple. This is somebody who has said yes, but it's not necessarily gone very far. You could also, and Paul, he even talks about this in his letter, he calls them baby Christians, okay? Now, that's not an insult to somebody. That's just trying to identify where is somebody spiritually. This is somebody who knows Jesus Christ personally, has intentionally chosen to follow him, to drop their nets. And they want to make Jesus the center of their life, but they don't necessarily know how to do that yet, okay? So their attitude is generally going to be positive towards Jesus and the church, but they're ignorant of what a life with Jesus looks like. This isn't something that's, they're doing intentionally to anger somebody, but they're just ignorant, right? So they're probably self-centered spiritually. It's about the feelings that they get from it. It's about, what do I get out of this? Is still really what people are talking about spiritually. And they might have a zeal to their spiritual life, but that zeal is going to eventually flag some, right? They might serve, but it's probably out of this zealousness or the obligation that they feel. So what do they need? They need some basic formation in what it means to follow Jesus. They need catechesis. And this is where catechesis really is supposed to enter in, is for those who are disciples. Now, there's preparatory catechesis, of course, that we do in the catechumenal model and there's ways to do evangelical or evangelizing catechesis, and we do need that as well, right? This kerygmatic catechesis. But really, catechesis is supposed to be aimed at the stages of discipleship so that we're growing people in their knowledge and in their understanding of the faith. So they also need the time in prayer and formation in what it means to be a Christian, how they're going to live out the moral life. And they're going to need relationships where they have good mentorship. And this is another thing that we're not very good at in Catholicism right now, is setting people up in these relationships where you can be mentored or coached or discipled into the life of Christianity. And I also believe here that clarity on the big picture of discipleship is key. So I'll tell you what I mean by this. I work with several individuals that I have a mentorship with or a discipleship relationship with, where I'm helping them to grow in the Christian life. And when I sit them down, I actually show them this chart. And I ask them to self-identify, where do you think you are in these different areas? And it may be that they say, well, I'm at this stage when it comes to my prayer life, but in the moral life, I'm in this stage. And they're identifying where they're at. And that tells me then we can agree upon what are the needs that you have, so that I can set up a plan of action to be able to work with somebody, to help pray with them, to help guide them, and to hold them accountable to growth in the Christian life. So this is what I mean by clarity on the big picture, because ultimately we're not aiming just to have a basic baby disciple or an intentional disciple. We're aiming for this last column over here at the very far right. We're aiming to have somebody be a multiplying disciple, or somebody who is a mature disciple. And I hope that makes sense, because really we don't want to settle. So if you look at the second stage, where Jesus is a friend, or otherwise a developing disciple, this is somebody who's growing closer to Jesus, but still has some ignorance that they have. Now, all of us, of course, have gaps in our knowledge, gaps in our understanding of things. That doesn't change, right? I'm not talking about, but the gaps are still very big in this stage. And they're still probably self-centered somewhat spiritually, but although a little bit more rhythm might be entering into the prayer life. And they have a regular sacramental life. They're starting to take on more of the personalization of the sacraments. And they might even try to evangelize, but only in certain safe situations, only in places, maybe they are helping run a small group at church or something of that nature. That's a safe place. They're not going to do it outside of these safe places. And their service is still sporadic because it's still probably self-centered. So what do they need? They still need further formation and accountability. They're still going to need some more catechesis, and the big picture of the church intermission is going to have to come back again and again. And I'm somebody who believes that understanding of who you are and why you're doing things is very big. So that's who you are as a child of God, as a Christian, your very identity that comes from God and the relationship you have with his son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, should be lived out in the big picture of my job is not done yet while I'm on this earth. I still have a lot of work, both personally and with others. So then we move into this next stage. Jesus is a close friend. This is the missionary disciple phase, maybe, which is what Pope Francis is talking about, right? Somebody who is on mission, somebody who is thinking a little bit more about the other and how am I going to evangelize. And so this is an active evangelization stage where they might even be able to help somebody come to the point of conversion where they understand what that takes in order to do that. They're praying every day and they're seeking personal formation themselves rather than depending upon others, okay? Their sacramental life is deep, it's regular, and they're moving towards a God-centered or other-centered kind of spirituality rather than the me-centeredness. And I think that all of us, of course, need a purging of that, but still it's moving more towards God-centered and other-centered. And so their service then is more consistent, and they're starting to work through their charisms. And what I mean by this is that they understand the gifts that God has given. A charism is a gift of the Spirit given to an individual for the good of the community. So this can be anything from an administrative gift to a speaking gift or teaching gift, a preaching gift. It could be the extraordinary gifts of the Holy Spirit that you see in the charismatic community. It could also be any number of other things. But they understand what gifts God has given them for the good of the community, and they're starting to serve and live those out for others. Okay, so that's what I mean by works through their charisms. Now, what do they need? These people need a deeper formation and accountability for mission. That means that they're going to have to be held accountable to the fact that their job as a missionary disciple is to be on mission. To their discipleship should spill out into fruitfulness. And others might need to hold them accountable because it gets tough in the work. It doesn't just mean just because I decide I want to do this work, I'm going to be fruitful immediately. Fruitfulness is not up to us so much. Again, as I talked about, it's up to the free will of another person and the work of God. But in this stage, generally, people are considered exemplary Christians. Now, one of the things that ends up happening here is that if somebody starts to be fruitful, if somebody starts to have this daily prayer routine, if somebody's living out these things, right? A lot of times you'll see that the Catholic community responds in almost like they're weird. We see this at the normal parish level where there are very few people who are in this stage at this point. And ultimately the community doesn't know what to do with them. And sometimes if it's a woman and she's single, a lot of times somebody or a man who is single, you'll see the responses, you should go be a priest, or you should go be a sister, or you should be a deacon if you're a married man. These kind of responses because people really don't know what to do so much. So they also need a lot of encouragement because of this, and guidance towards holiness and mission are very much at the forefront. What does it look like for me personally? Where is my mission field? What does holiness in my life, and at this point, and in this culture I'm in, what does it look like lived out in my context? Okay? And then the last stage, which is really what we should all be aiming at. This is the big picture stage right here. This is where we're all supposed to be. And that is that Jesus is our best friend. And we're a multiplying disciple. And what I mean by a multiplying disciple is somebody who is not just making converts, but is forming other people to missionary discipleship so that they also, the people they're working with, are also fruitful. So you see that I'm not just making disciples myself, but the people I'm working with are making disciples. and it's multiplying out. Just as Paul talked about in 2 Timothy 2:2, he tells Timothy, I want you to go and find other men and train them how I trained you so that they can do the same with others. So you see, it's not just Paul to Timothy, but it's Paul to Timothy to others, and then to even another generation. So we see we're multiplying out the work. And even Paul, of course, was a disciple of Jesus Christ. So what do we have? We have multiple generations being multiplied so that the world can be reached. This is the model of Jesus Christ. So this multiplying discipleship is really about discipling others who are doing the same. We're spiritually multiplying. Prayer has to be deep and consistent and daily at this point, because otherwise we can't be fruitful if we're not praying. We really can't. And a person is generally considered pretty knowledgeable about scripture, about doctrinal stuff. They're probably somebody who is not just consuming at a parish. They're the ones who are the top servants at a parish. They're the ones who are even outside the parish who are evangelizing. They're the ones who have a mission field at work and in the neighborhoods. Okay, they're other-centered. They're God-centered. There's a lot of humility, and they're really working through their charisms. They understand what God has done with them, and they're starting to live that out. Now, one of the things about moving through these stages, you'll see that the needs change. And one of the gifts of understanding the stages of both pre-evangelization, then to evangelization, and then into discipleship, is we start to see, what does a person need? What kind of relationship do we need to offer to them, and how do we respond to them? Now, even with this knowledge, another disclaimer, every individual is an individual. So they need individual help, individual needs. We're not going to be able to just say, oh, well, I see that you're a missionary disciple, therefore I'm going to have to help you with deep formation, accountability, and encouragement. That's just not how it works, right? So we have to tailor, in a sense, a plan of action when we're working with somebody one-on-one or in small groups to be able to do this stuff. So I don't want this to seem like, okay, we're just going to box up evangelization or whatnot and be able to throw it out there in a way that's another programmatic element. Really, evangelization and pre-evangelization, evangelization, discipleship can have programmatic elements, but it's primarily about relationship, primarily about the love of and sharing it of God with others. Okay? So I think, Jared, I'm going to toss it back over to you for a second and see if we got any questions for people, because I think we can do a little bit more. And I don't want to just drone on about things I want to hear. I want to hear what other people want to hear. And so maybe I could take some questions at this point.
Sounds good. We do have a lot of questions, so that's a great idea, I think. Yeah, if you haven't done so already, feel free to jump in and throw out a question for Marcel, and we will discuss those here. Let me just get situated and get some questions going here.
Sounds all right. Good.
So we've got first of all, Mary asked if she can get a copy of that sheet that you just showed a minute ago. So if you want to, if people want to find that, what's the best way to do that? Go to your website, or what would you say?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to be posting about that on my blog sometime in the next week. So you'll be able to find it on our website on the blog in the next week.
And it's CatholicMissionaryDisciples.com, correct?
Yeah, and then you can go and find it under resources in the blog.
Great, wonderful. Okay, so we've got a question here about faith formation for middle school, high school. Should middle school, high school faith formation or family faith formation, which has become popular lately, start at the pre-evangelization stage? And probably the subsequent question is, how would you actually go about doing that? What would be different?
Yeah, very good question. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that here are the issues when it comes to faith formation in a parish environment, at all ages and stages. That you're mandated generally from a diocesan viewpoint on things that you're going to have to deliver, right? That you're going to have to use a certain kind of textbook that the parish is going to tell you what you're going to have to do, or the diocese. You're going to have to do these things in order to qualify for what the diocese says are the steps of catechetical formation at this age or whatnot. So first of all, you're going to have to do those things within the classroom. And since we still have a classroom-based model, you're going to have to do those things in order to be, in a sense, obedient to the powers that be, but also so that we're doing the things that are asked of us as catechists. Now, Kerygmatic catechesis is one of the ways I would probably go about this, where what I would do is I would try to form the relationships with a little bit more of a dialogue, so that it's not just somebody who's we're so used to classrooms being based on kind of the, you know, the expert giving to the consumers who are going to consume my expertise, that unfortunately it's not in a dialogue. And I think moving to a dialogue with young people, especially in today's environment where they do have questions and they're real, we need to honor the fact that they have questions, opens up opportunities for the relationship building in the pre-evangelization and evangelization stages. Now, again, you probably are going to have, you know, an hour, maybe two of touch points at best in a week with young people if you're doing catechesis with them, which means that, you know, there may not be a lot of opportunities to do something else. Now, I would say that in the youth ministry, outside of the classroom, I think this is where a lot of pre-evangelization and evangelization really can take place. And what I mean by that is that's where you can break it down from, instead of just having a classroom or a large group, where you can break it down into smaller groups, and in those relationships, carry those out to where you're really building the relationships in those kind of contexts. So you have to think about, where can I break it down? Where, especially in youth ministry, where can I get kids into places where they feel like there's safety, in a sense, to be able to build these bridges of trust? Because a lot of the kids, unfortunately, are not, in fact, the vast majority are not going to be disciples who are in your youth ministry programs. So what you're going to have to do is start to train both yourself, if necessary, but also others. And the way I would put this for a youth minister, let's just say in a youth minister context, I would, as a youth minister, be putting most of my time in the formation of my volunteers and core team, and training them on how to build these relationships and what it looks like to do this stuff, so that they then can work directly with the students and the youth, and build these relationships so that they can understand what it means to move somebody from pre-evangelization to evangelization to discipleship. And I hope that answers the question.
We've got a number of other questions that are similar to this one.
Okay.
So and I'm going to rephrase, but
Okay.
How do we work with pastors who may not see forming missionary disciples as something that's important?
Yeah. Well, you know, you've heard of water on a rock, right? The water eventually wins. And I think a lot of times what happens is there are going to be barriers in every parish, in every diocese. It's just a matter of identifying where are the barriers. What are the things that I can do as an individual? Now, let's take it from a volunteer standpoint. There's only so much you can do, in a sense, while you're on parish grounds, and you're supposed to be doing certain things and obedient to your pastor. You're probably not going to alone be able to change his mind just because you have a dialogue with him and you're passionate about these things. But what you can do is you can be fruitful even without your pastor's support. And I have seen volunteers in parishes over the course of many years be that water against the rock that has changed the culture of a parish to the point where the pastor's heart is won over. They decide, I can't just manage this status quo or even the decline anymore, but rather I have to move out into mission myself, and things are going to have to change. And I've seen it because the fruitfulness cannot be denied. So I would say aim for fruitfulness in your own personal life and where you have influence. So where are your gifts, though? Where are the points of influence that you can have on other people's lives? If that's, you know, peer-to-peer, if that's with somebody who's younger, whatever it may be, find that place, be fruitful, and then continue the dialogue with your pastor. But do it out of, you know, some real humble reverence also for the fact that he is your pastor. And then finally, I'd say pray for him and pray for our priests, because our priests are not necessarily trained in order to lead a 21st century parish into culture change. Now, that doesn't mean they can't do it, but they aren't necessarily in their formation in the seminary. That's not what it's setting them up for, is culture change. It's setting them up for, okay, I'm going to administer and pastor this parish. That's what they're set up for. So changing is hard, and it is for all of us. So pray for our pastors as well.
Good, thanks. We have a number of questions similar to that. I love that answer and the metaphor that you used. See that there's some questions about I know in my work, family faith formation seems to be something that people are
Mhm.
more and more moving towards that model. And
Yeah.
just the question that she asked is, how do we get, so my parish uses intergenerational faith formation, how do we get catechesis
Mhm.
so backward? How do we move from children-based formation to lifelong? Any suggestions on that, especially based in the context of what you've been talking about today?
Yeah, I think a lifelong formation is absolutely necessary, and really what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to start to form adults who really want to do this. Also, I would, and here are some things that here's an acronym for you on how you're going to identify other adults who might have the kind of personality and openness to also gathering with them. And the acronym is FACT, F-A-C-T. Okay, you're looking for people who are faithful, available, contagious, and teachable. Faithful, available, contagious, and teachable. So the faithful people are those people, of course, who are intentional disciples. There are people who are already there. And those people are going to be a lot more easy, a lot easier to work with because they're the people who already have the relationship with Jesus Christ that they're living out of. Available, though, is very big. In fact, I run a group of young men, and one of the things that we did when we self-selected who we were going to invite into this group, one of the big things was, are these people not only leaders, but are they available? Are they flaky? Are they the kind of people who you never know if they're going to show up for an appointment or not? And if not, we didn't invite them. We wanted them to be available so that we could invest in them and in turn have challenged them to invest in others. Contagious, in other words, are they somebody who has a personality that people can gather around? And then teachable. So there's got to be a humility there. I don't know everything. I'm going to have to learn. Look for those four things. Try to gather people around you who have that, and then go for, in a sense, the low-hanging fruit first. Because you're going to have to show that lives are changed, that families are changed in faith formation, and that these families and these couples and families that are willing to do this stuff, who show those kind of attributes, if you can get them on board, others will eventually start to see, wow, look at the community they have over there, look at the fruitfulness they have over there, look at the difference that they're making, this group of people over there. And it's going to start to be infectious, and other people are going to start to want that as well. But you got to form a community, I think, to really be able to do it well.
We have an interesting question from Tom. He says, are children in the pews who haven't encountered the Lord personally the same as nuns?
Well, the answer is no. And generally speaking, here's the difference. Developmentally, and by the way, I'm not a developmental psychologist, disclaimer, I'm not somebody who is an adolescent expert either. And maybe Jared could find somebody who could answer this question a little bit more accurately than me. But I would say no, because nuns are generally people who have intentionally chosen to not believe. They're people who have at least reached an age where they've started to work through this stuff intentionally or even unintentionally, but started to work through intellectually is there a God, is there meaning to life, this other stuff, and they've rejected the answer that at least they assigned to Christianity, even if it's not the proper answer. And ultimately, that's what ends up happening with most nuns, the NONES, is that they assign an answer to Christianity that they reject. So, for instance, I've met a number of atheists who tell me things like, I reject God because I don't believe in a God who would, murder babies or send, natural disasters upon innocent people and do it arbitrarily. That's an evil God. And I tell them, I don't believe in that God either. And I don't think a lot of kids, let's say, a 9-year-old kid who hasn't necessarily intentionally dropped their nets to be a disciple yet, has also rejected that as well, or made that kind of leap to that point either. So I would say no, that we shouldn't identify them as nuns, but we might want to identify them as somebody who has been sacramentalized, maybe even somewhat catechized, and is in need of evangelization. Okay, so the labeling, of course, is a little bit different, but in our common parlance that we've been using in the sociologists who do all the surveys and whatnot, when they're identifying nuns, they're generally talking about adults who have rejected or have walked away from faith.
So along that, going with those nuns, here's a question from Charlie. He says, what are some signs of hunger for God in an unevangelized seeker how do you awaken it so as to invite to surface, beyond curiosity? Trying to, he says in parentheses, trying to avoid apologetics too soon, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, and good question, by the way. And by the way, I think apologetics at that stage, it's not that you avoid it, but what you want to do is you want to be very discerning in how you use it properly. We don't want to use it as something that we lead with, but we might need to respond with, because they, in a natural conversation, somebody might ask, why do Catholics do this, or why do Christians believe in this kind of God? And you might need to provide some kind of apologetic answer, but I would do so matter-of-factly and kind of short, to give enough to answer the question, not necessarily pound them with the information. Now, that being said, I do think that at this stage, there should be more listening than talking. And you should be asking more questions than they should be asking. And what I do is I try to guide with the right kind of questions. So I ask questions like, tell me what faith, if any, what kind of faith you were brought up in. What was your home like? Did your parents believe or go to church? What's your experience of God? Have you ever had an encounter with God? Tell me what you know about Jesus Christ. Tell me what is there something about Catholicism that you know and like? Can you identify that for me? Whatever those kind of questions are, and I've got long lists of them that I've written out for others as well. I think those are the kind that kind of prick at somebody to get them to think about things of faith, about Jesus Christ, about the church, in order to try to stimulate these kind of things so that we're opening up the door of the heart, and that making room, in a sense, for the Holy Spirit to act on somebody. And I do think those questions are a very integral part of this relationship building as well, because people really want you to show an interest in them, don't they? I mean, what's the number one thing people want to talk about? It's themselves. So if you can get them talking about themselves and really listen, not to respond, but listen to understand, then really that's the goal. And one of the mottos that I try to live my evangelical life out of, in the sense when I evangelize, is that understanding does not necessarily equate to acceptance. Understanding does not mean acceptance. So just because I understand a viewpoint or where somebody's coming from does not mean I have to accept it. So if somebody is, living a lifestyle that's very far from God and counter to what the Catholic Church's moral teachings are, I can understand their experience and still not accept that their lifestyle is necessarily a healthy one for them. And that's so understanding does not equate to acceptance. And it's a real tender way of treating people, I think, when we're really listening to them and entering into this. And I will be honest, I'm not even necessarily the best one at it. I know people who are much better listeners, much better at this stage of the relationship. But I think we all play a part in it. Let's put it that way.
I really like the distinction you just made there, the difference between listen to respond, which I feel like also often when we're in those conversations, especially if we're in a role like in behalf of the parish, you want to be able to say the right thing, but listen to understand, which would change the questions you're asking. You're asking questions to understand, and like, love that second point is not to accept, but just to understand where they're coming from, because people want to be heard, they want to be listened to. Great pre-evangelization tactic there. Just curious, one of the things that struck me the most in the document that you had about the discipleship was that, that it's challenging to me even, that Jesus being a close friend to Jesus being your best friend, that transition for the prayer, some of the markers you said, prayer daily versus praying, is intimate. Praying is, something that you feel is a deep experience as opposed to just doing it every day and making sure that it's part. Lent's a great time, I think, to reflect on making that jump. Any suggestions for people, not necessarily related to Lent, but Lent's a good opportunity. Suggestions for people on how to, everyone in this webinar is involved. Everyone is doing everything. How do we get them to go even deeper in their relationship with Christ?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you got to have somebody to be accountable to. And I will tell you, this is another thing I think that's a weakness in the Catholic Church, is that we don't have people in leadership who are accountable to one another. And it's unfortunate, because then we can't be held to a higher standard. And accountability is not, hey, you're doing something wrong, Jared, or you've messed up. Accountability is, Jared, you told me that what you want is to grow in your prayer life. So tell me how you do it. And then it's a listening, and it's an accompaniment, as Pope Francis talks about it. Accountability is not a finger wagging or a coming down hard on somebody. Accountability is really about walking with other people. so that the two of us can walk toward Jesus Christ and that we can grow in our love of him. And I think that unfortunately we don't have the kind of relationships in Catholicism right now that lend themselves to real accountability, that are based on an intimacy. So the first step, though, is that you got to build the relationship of trust. Where trust is established, then you can be intimate, because you're allowing somebody into a special place of your life. And then once there's intimacy established, then you can be accountable. So it takes time and it takes investment. And a lot of us don't have these kind of relationships. Now, part of it is we don't have a whole lot of disciples out there who are in our parishes or in our dioceses. So how am I, if I am a disciple and I want to grow in this faith, I've got to surround myself with other people who are also somewhere close to me so that we can be accountable and go forward together. And this is hard for a lot of people to find somebody. I know people who struggle. They say, I can't find a spiritual director. I can't find somebody that I can really walk with. I understand, and I'm sorry that that's the case, but I would not give up looking for those people. And I think once you have somebody like that, I would build that relationship and really invest in it, because once you have accountability where the 2 people, 3 people are walking together, a small group of people are walking together regularly, and really understand that this is the goal, not just this basic stuff, but really this intimate life with Jesus Christ, this growth of holiness, this growth in the moral life, growth in mission and fruitfulness, that if we can do that, it pushes us forward. I've been blessed to be able to have these kind of relationships. And I got to tell you, without them, I wouldn't be nearly as good as I am with them. Because by myself, I'm not a very good Christian. But with others and with God's grace, at least I can be an adequate Christian. Let's put it that way.
Can you give us more detail on what that means? So is it a men's group you talked about earlier, like a weekly Bible study? Is it just a kind of a couple of guys you can turn to, or what does that look like?
Yeah, and okay, so first of all, it doesn't have to be something where it's super duper structured, okay? But it has to be regular. And what I mean by that is it has to be intentional, and it has to be regular. Intentional in that we share the same vision and the same outcomes, so that we understand where we're going and why we're going there. So this is kind of you got to have your mission right, you got to have your vision right. And then once that's the case, it can be done one-on-one, or it can be done in a small group. Now, when I was talking about the men's group that I'm working with, these are younger guys, and what I'm doing is I've got 3 other guys who are parishioners locally, and I've been working with them for the last 2 years and training them on how to run the group of young adults. So these are everywhere from like a 60-year-old, a 40-year-old, and a 30-year-old, the 60-something, 40-something, 30-something-year-old who are running a bunch of late teen and a bunch of college student guys. And they're the ones who are guiding them. And I'm guiding the parishioners in how to do this stuff. I'm actually going to step out after doing this for 2 years, probably this next year, because they're adequately trained to be able to do this. And they form their own community. And I have my personal friends that I walk with. I have my spiritual director. I have my wife, and I have about 3 friends who are guys who we hold each other accountable to these things. And we meet regularly. We meet weekly basis so that we can talk and pray together, so that we can really discuss and challenge one another in our relationships, in our prayer, in our mission, in our moral life, and what we're struggling with, and what we're building on our strengths. So it doesn't have to necessarily be, okay, I'm going to run a Bible study, I'm going to run this. And in fact, I think sometimes the structures don't lend themselves to the real growth, because what ends up happening is we fall back into that stuff rather than having a real conversation, a human conversation that's led by the Spirit. But I do think prayer is an integral part of whatever you do, and doing it regularly and intentionally. I hope that answers your question, Jared.
It does, and I find that personally very helpful, and I'm sure many other do as well. Like you said, you can get kind of lonely at the top when there's people that are involved in doing lots of stuff, and that's a lot of people in this group are. There's a lot of questions, Marcel, more than we could have covered, obviously, in the time we had. Can you tell us what's the best place to reach out to you, to contact you with questions, to kind of have a conversation with you?
Yeah, so if you want to reach me, you can email me at catholicmissionarydisciples@gmail.com. Go to our website, catholicmissionarydisciples.com. And I'll tell you, I understand that people who are in pastoral ministry right now, who have a desire to grow in evangelization and discipleship, you might be questioning, well, where do I go from here? And well, that's actually what we do with our new nonprofit apostolate. That's what we do, is we train leaders on how to do this stuff so that they can be more fruitful in their ministry, so that they can start to make other missionary disciples. So the stuff I'm talking about today is what we actually do with people. And the reason why I do it, I'll be honest, it's kind of experimental. There's nobody else doing the model that we have. There's nobody else out there doing quite the way we're doing it. And I'm trying to experiment because I think the church needs something new. So if you got any questions, reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are searching for something new, and this is a good idea and a good opportunity to, discipleship is something that is new to us as Catholics, and I'm looking forward to hearing how your apostolate grows and the things that you do. So thank you so much for being with us and doing this presentation today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, and God bless everybody.
All right, just a couple more things before we go. I just want to thank once again the partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, National Association for Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. This webinar, like we said, is being recorded. It's going to be added to a large library of webinars. They're on our YouTube channel, as well as at avemariapress.com/webinar-videos. The next webinar is going to be on March 6th. We're going to be continuing a series that, especially with NCCL, the NCCL Adult Faith Formation Committee, they've been doing a Seasons of Faith series that we actually had to reschedule the event with Sister Janet Schaefer because she had an injury. So that'll actually be coming afterwards, but we're focusing in the next group with the panel on faith formation with older adults, so 75 years and older, and we'll have a panel of experts to join us there at 3 o'clock Eastern, March 6, 2018. That'll be our next event. So thanks everybody for being with us today and for being a part of this series, and look forward to welcoming you back next time. And Marcel, once again, thanks so much for your time today.
All right, thanks, Jared. God bless. Bye-bye.
All right, bye everybody.